Hi, my name's Charlotte Vallins and I'm a commercial property solicitor based in Ashtons commercial property team in Cambridge. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the challenges facing commercial landlords and tenants in terms of rent payment in the current COVID-19 climate. Obviously tenants, particularly tenants of pub, restaurant, retail premises, are all struggling at the moment. What the landlords and tenants of various properties are seeking to do is to adopt alternative rent payment structures. So this assists the tenant in terms of rent payment and the landlord, obviously, who wants to have their rent paid and their premises occupied. Traditionally, tenants have been required to pay rent quarterly by equal in advance instalments, but this is set to change in the current situation. There are various alternative rent structures and I'm going to explore a few of those now. One of the simplest alternative rent payment structures is to require a tenant to pay rent monthly. Many commercial leases are already set up for monthly rent payments, for example leases of flexible office spaces. However, as I've already mentioned, traditionally commercial leases require a tenant to pay rent quarterly in advance. Monthly rent payments can be great for a tenant because it really does assist their cash flow. They can be less great for a landlord who is used to accepting quarterly rent payments. In addition, a landlord must also check, if it has a charge on the property from a lender, that the lender does consent or otherwise approve to the change to monthly rent payments. Any monthly rent payment regime must be properly documented to ensure that at the end of this current situation, when things hopefully go back to normal, a landlord can revert to accepting rent from a tenant on a quarterly basis. Another alternative is a turnover rent setup. This is where a tenant pays rent to a landlord based on its current turnover. You would imagine that would be great for a tenant in the current climate. If it's doing less well, it pays less rent to the landlord. If it's doing better, it pays more rent. Perhaps not quite so appealing from a landlord's perspective, but the landlord does need to weigh up whether it would prefer to have a tenant in its premises paying rent, or alternatively a tenant who, because of the non-turnover rent payment regime in their lease, perhaps goes insolvent, vacates the premises, and then the landlord doesn't receive any rent. The way a turnover rent regime works is that the tenant will pay a minimum payment to the landlord, and that minimum payment will then be topped up, perhaps at the end of the year, or whatever is agreed between the landlord and the tenant, based on a percentage of their turnover for that period. Turnover rent provisions can be very complicated, so it's important that for a tenant and for the landlord that solicitors and other advisors are involved in, first of all, agreeing what the turnover provisions are to incorporate, and secondly, in documenting them. The landlord does accept, as we've said, much of the risk of the current climate in adopting a turnover rent regime, but it can be very advantageous for both parties. It's really important that a tenant provides the landlord with accurate trading figures and that the landlord agrees with the tenant precisely what those turnover figures are based on. For example, if a tenant has online sales as well as sales from a physical premises, are the online sales going to be included in the trading figures for the purposes of the turnover accounts? These are all things that should be agreed between the landlord and the tenant before the arrangement is documented. A third alternative is to consider how the rent paid under a lease is reviewed. A landlord, for a lease of any more than a few years, will usually want the rent to be reviewed and most often increased. This is traditionally done on the basis of market rents, but rent can also be reviewed on the basis of inflation figures. Often the RPI is used for this, so the Retail Prices Index. But the CPI, so the Consumer Prices Index, can also be used, and that's slightly less than the RPI. Essentially what happens is that the rent paid by the tenant tracks the rate of inflation. The landlord and the tenant will need to make various considerations. For example, should there be a cap on the level of rent the tenant pays following the review? Or alternatively, should there be a collar, so a minimum level of rent the tenant pays following the review? Or indeed, should there be both, a cap and a collar? Other considerations are whether, if the inflation figure referred to in the lease is no longer published, what should be used instead. For example, the government is considering phasing out the RPI in the next 10 years or so. Either way, whatever is agreed between the parties should be properly documented. In summary, if the landlord and the tenant of a premises are willing to be flexible, then there really are some good alternatives in terms of rent payment regimes, which will ensure that a tenant's business can continue to operate while the landlord has occupied premises and continues to receive a rental.